The President Clinton years, 1992 to 2000. When last we spoke, President George H.W. Bush was a very popular president of the United States. He had just successfully led the nation into its first war since Vietnam, and that war, unlike Vietnam, was short, it was quick, and, by most measures, it was successful. Iraq left Kuwait. Following the end of that war, President Bush's approval rating was at 91%, a staggeringly high approval rating for any president. However, President Bush's popularity would not remain. In less than a year, it would drop precipitously. There were many reasons why President Bush's popularity began to diminish. The first goes back to the reason that he was ultimately so popular: the quick, successful war waged in the Persian Gulf against Iraq. Again, President Bush was able to get Iraq to leave Kuwait, but he stopped short of removing Saddam Hussein from power. Initially, this seemed okay, but when Saddam Hussein started to make trouble again in the Middle East, many people began to question Bush and his foreign policy decisions. More than that, however, it was things at home that plagued President Bush. The first was a pretty severe recession in 1991 into 1992. The American economy took a downturn, unemployment increased, and President Bush, as the leader of the economy, took the blame for that. But perhaps even more damaging to President Bush was breaking a promise that he had made during his first presidential election. I skipped the federal deficit, which had risen as the United States had paid for a war and spent more and more money, something that Americans who wanted a conservative and smaller government did not find very appealing. But as I said earlier, President Bush had made a campaign promise not to raise taxes. Famously, he had said to the American people, "Read my lips, no new taxes." That's a pretty firm statement. Well, you guessed it. Upon seeing the size of the deficit and realizing there was no other option, President Bush raised taxes. This sealed his fate, and in came a newcomer to the presidency, a Democrat. Born in Hope, Arkansas in 1946, of very humble origins, Bill Clinton grew up poor. He was first the governor of Arkansas, and he billed himself as a New Democrat. And a New Democrat stood for both conservative and liberal ideals. He believed in strong national defense, which is certainly a conservative statement, but he also believed in helping out the poor and the weak, something he had learned from his idol, President John F. Kennedy, and you can see them there shaking hands. As Bill Clinton was a young man, he got to meet his idol, John F. Kennedy. So Bill Clinton comes to office, and as I said, he was a New Democrat. He was moderate. He wasn't liberal like perhaps Jimmy Carter, who was the Democratic president in 1976 through 1980. He took tough stands on crime, free trade, welfare reform, and had close ties with corporations, again, a relatively conservative stance. However, unlike conservatives, he did believe that government was necessary and important, but he also recognized that in the past couple of decades, government had grown too large. And because it was so large, it was inefficient, it was slow, and it ultimately didn't serve the needs of the American people. His election was somewhat symbolic in the United States. His election showed that American people were ready for a change. Over the past 2 decades, since the election of Richard Nixon in 1968, Americans had chosen a Republican president 5 out of 6 times. The only exception to that, of course, being President Jimmy Carter in 1976. So Clinton was a sign that America was changing, that it was looking for something new, that it was looking for a fresh face. And under Clinton, America was very successful. Extremely low unemployment, low poverty, increasing family incomes, and unlike all of his predecessors, we actually had a budget surplus, which meant we weren't in debt, we actually had more money than we were spending. Truly, the 1990s were America's time. We were on top of the world. Communism had collapsed. The economy was in, as they said, overdrive. Technology out in San Francisco, the Silicon Valley, computers, the internet revolution, all of these things added money and growth to the American economy, which added money to our tax base, which made things much, much better for the United States of America. And Clinton got a lot of the credit. In addition, globalization took off, and in 1996, the American people easily returned President Clinton to office again for his second term. Things were promising, and they were on the upswing. As we said, poverty was low, the average family income was growing, and the federal budget went from having a deficit to now having a surplus, the first time in decades that America would actually be able to pay all of its bills. Things seemed great, but appearances can be deceiving. Bill Clinton had a problem. And that problem stemmed from his relationship with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. It came to light that Clinton had probably had an affair with Miss Lewinsky, but of course he denied it and denied it under oath. These charges led the Republican majority to impeach Clinton. Now again, to impeach does not mean to remove from office. It merely means to accuse of a crime. And Mr. Clinton was accused of two crimes. He was impeached on the charges of perjury and obstruction of justice, meaning that he prevented the authorities from doing what they needed to do in order to investigate him. He, like all other Americans, was entitled to a trial. And January 1999, as a nervous nation watched, President Clinton was tried by the Senate. He was acquitted on both counts, meaning, after hearing all the evidence, members of the Senate narrowly said that President Clinton was innocent of the crimes he was accused of. The Senate ruled that 55 to 45, not guilty, and 50-50 on the obstruction of justice charges. But given, however, that the Vice President, in this case Al Gore, presides over the Senate and casts a tie-breaking vote, President Clinton was found innocent, or I should say, not guilty, of both of these charges. This particular scandal tainted President Clinton and perhaps taints his legacy as a successful president during the 90s, at least dealing with things domestically in the United States.